I was promised to him since we were children. That's what my mother told me every night before bed, her hand smoothing my hair back from my forehead, like she was already preparing me to be presented. You belong to Park Ji-woon, she would say. And the words settled into my bones like they'd always been there, like they'd grown there alongside my marrow. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? When you're 4 years old and a boy with sharp eyes and softer hands than you expected sits beside you at a family gathering and doesn't leave, when he lets you hold onto his sleeve because the room is too loud and your omega senses are still raw and overwhelming, you remember that, you hold on to that, you build your entire understanding of love around that single, unremarkable moment, and you call it destiny. I called it destiny. The Park and Lee families had been intertwined for generations, business partners first, then political allies, and finally inevitably blood. The arrangement between Ji-woon and me wasn't written on paper with signatures and seals. It was older than that. It was spoken into existence at a dinner table when we were still in our mothers' wombs. 2 alpha families, producing an alpha heir and an omega son. And everyone at that table knew exactly what that meant. They didn't ask us. They didn't have to. This was how our world worked. But I didn't mind. I never minded. I used to count the days between his visits. The Park estate was 3 hours from ours, and his father's schedule was unforgiving. But once every few months, the black cars would pull through our gates and I would press my face against the window glass, breath fogging up the surface as I watched him step out. He was always so composed, even at 8 years old, shoulders back, expression neutral, already being shaped into the heir his family needed him to be. But when he saw me waiting at the door, something would shift, just slightly. The corners of his mouth would soften, his pace would quicken by half a step, and I would think, there he is. There's my alpha. I memorized everything about him. The way he took his tea barely sweetened, just a touch of honey. The books he mentioned in passing that I would later beg my tutor to find for me, so I could read them too, so I could have something to talk to him about when he returned. The fact that he didn't like loud noises but would endure crowded rooms if I stayed close. The scar on his left palm from a childhood accident he never explained, and I never asked because some things felt too sacred to touch. I kept these details like treasures. I polished them in my mind until they shone. At 12, I wrote him a letter, just one. I told him I hoped he was well, that I was learning piano because his mother had mentioned he played, that I missed him when he was gone. I never sent it. I was too afraid of what his silence might mean if he received it and chose not to respond. Instead, I folded it into a small square and tucked it beneath my pillow, and I told myself that when we were finally bonded, when we shared a home and a bed and a life, I would show it to him. I would say, see, I was always yours. Even then, that was the foundation of me. That was the shape of my heart. Park Ji-woon was my alpha. He always had been. I didn't know how to be anyone else's. The engagement was announced when I turned 20. There was no proposal, no bent knee or velvet box or trembling question. Just a formal dinner with both families present. My father raising his glass and saying, "We're pleased to finally make official what has always been understood." Ji-woon sat beside me, his shoulder not quite touching mine, and when the room applauded, he turned to look at me with something that might have been warmth if I squinted hard enough. I smiled back. I told myself this was enough, because he was good to me in his way. After the engagement, we began spending more time together. Weekly dinners at restaurants he chose, always quiet, always private. Walks through the Park family gardens, where he would point out flowers his grandmother had planted before she passed. Sometimes, when the evening grew late and the drive back to my family's estate felt too long, he would offer me the guest room in his wing of the house. He was polite, he was gentle, he was protective in subtle ways, a hand at the small of my back when we crossed streets, a sharp glance at anyone who looked at me too long, a coat draped over my shoulders when I shivered. But there was no heat, no urgency, no moment where he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world worth seeing, and I knew that something was missing. I could feel it in the way he held my hand, like it was an obligation rather than a choice. I could hear it in the silences that stretched between us, filled with all the things neither of us said, but I was so good at making excuses for him. He's just not expressive. His family raised him to be restrained. Alphas like him don't wear their hearts on their sleeves. This is just how he loves, quietly, steadily, without fanfare, and besides, he kept me close. He called me his fiancé in public. He introduced me to his colleagues and his family's associates, and everyone who mattered in his world. When I was unwell, he sent his personal physician. When I mentioned wanting to visit a particular gallery exhibit, he cleared his schedule and accompanied me without complaint. That was something. That had to be something, wasn't it? At night, alone in my room, I would replay our interactions like a film. I was trying to find meaning in the way he said my name, Hyun, soft and careful, like he was handling something fragile. The time he caught me staring at him across a dinner table and held my gaze for 3 full seconds before looking away, and how my heart had pounded so hard I thought I might faint. The evening, he walked me to my car and paused with his hand on the door, and for one breathless moment, I thought he might finally lean in, might finally drive safely, he said. I nodded. I smiled. I drove away, and then it cried the whole way home. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because nothing had gone right. And I didn't know how to name that ache. I didn't know if I was allowed to want more when I'd already been given so much. He is my alpha. He always has been. Then why does it feel like I'm waiting for something that's never going to come? Seojin came into our lives like spring, sudden and warm and impossible to resent, even when I should have. We met during my first year of university, 2 omegas in a sea of alphas and betas who didn't quite know what to do with us. He found me hiding in a corner of the library during orientation week, overwhelmed by the noise and the newness, and the sheer weight of being perceived by so many strangers at once. You look like you need this, he said, sliding a cup of honey tea across the table. I looked up. He was beautiful in an effortless way, bright eyes, easy smile, the kind of presence that made you feel like you'd known him your whole life, even though you just met. I'm Han Seojin, he said. And you're Lee Hyun, right? I saw your name on the Omega dormitory list. We're on the same floor. That was it. That was the beginning. Seojin became my anchor in a way I hadn't expected. He was everything I wasn't: confident, outgoing, comfortable in his own skin. He laughed freely and spoke his mind and attracted attention without ever seeming to try. People gravitated toward him. I gravitated toward him. How could I not? He made me feel seen in a world where I'd spent my whole life feeling like a supporting character in someone else's story. We shared meals and study sessions and late nights where he would listen to me talk about Jiwoon with the patience of someone who genuinely cared. He never judged my insecurities. He never told me I was being foolish for holding onto a childhood promise. He just listened and nodded and occasionally said, "He's lucky to have you, Hyun." I hope he knows that. I loved Seojin as a friend, as a brother, as the person who made me feel less alone, which is why I was so proud to introduce him to Jiwoon. The 3 of us met at a cafe near campus, a neutral space I'd chosen specifically because it felt safe. Seojin arrived first, already laughing about something that had happened in his morning lecture, and I felt myself relax into the familiar comfort of his presence. This would be fine. This would be good. Jiwoon would see the person who had become so important to me, and maybe it would help him understand me better. Jiwoon walked in 10 minutes later, impeccable as always, in a dark coat and pressed shirt, his alpha presence subtly filling the space. I stood to greet him, already smiling, already reaching for his arm in that automatic way I always did. Jiwoon, this is my best friend, Han Seojin. And then it happened. A pause. Just a fraction of a second. Barely long enough to notice. But I did notice, because I noticed everything when it came to Jiwoon. The slight flare of his nostrils, the way his pupils dilated just slightly before he controlled them, the almost imperceptible shift in his scent, something sharper, something interested, before it smoothed back into his usual calm. Cedar and rain. Seojin bowed politely. It's nice to finally meet you. Hyun talks about you constantly. Jiwoon's expression was perfectly neutral. Likewise. He speaks highly of you. But his voice, there was something there. A thread of warmth I'd rarely heard directed at anyone. let alone a stranger. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was imagining things. Because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. It's nothing. You're being paranoid. He's just being polite to your friend. I smiled. I sat down. I pretended my hands weren't trembling beneath the table. And the afternoon continued, pleasant and ordinary, while something I couldn't name began to take root in the space between the three of us. The changes were subtle. That was the cruel part. If they had been obvious, I might have confronted them sooner. I might have screamed or cried or demanded answers. But they came in whispers, in half glances, in questions that seemed innocent on the surface. Is Seojin joining us for dinner? Jawoon asked one evening, his tone casual. Too casual. I blinked. I didn't invite him. Should I have? No, I was just curious. He returned his attention to his meal. He mentioned last week that he enjoys Italian. There's a new place I thought might be worth trying. The three of us, perhaps. He mentioned last week. Jawoon remembered something Seojin had said last week. Something so small, so insignificant, that even I had forgotten it. But Jawoon remembered. I felt something cold settle in my chest. That sounds nice, I heard myself say. I'll ask him. Another time, we were walking through a department store when Jawoon paused in front of a display of silk scarves. He reached out and touched one soft blue, the exact shade of Seojin's favorite sweater. Seojin would look good in this color, he murmured, almost to himself. Then he seemed to catch himself. His hand dropped. He turned to me with an expression that was carefully blank. We should keep moving. I nodded. I followed. I didn't say a word. But that night, alone in my room, I stared at my reflection and asked myself questions I'd been avoiding for weeks. Why does he smile more when Seojin is around? Why does he laugh at Seojin's jokes? Really laugh? The kind of laugh I've heard maybe twice in all the years I've known him. Why does he look more alive in Seojin's presence than he ever has in mine? The answers were there, waiting for me like stones at the bottom of a river. I could feel their weight, but I wasn't ready to drown yet. So I did what I always did. I made excuses. Seojin is easy to talk to. Everyone feels comfortable around him. Jawoon is just finally opening up, and Seojin happens to be there. This is a good thing. This means Jawoon is learning to be more expressive. Maybe he'll learn to be that way with me too. Maybe, eventually, if I just wait long enough. 3 months after the introduction, something happened that made me believe truly, desperately believe that I had been wrong about everything. It was late. We were at Jawoon's apartment, a sleek penthouse he rarely used, but had invited me to that evening. I'd been feeling unwell all day, nothing specific, just the bone-deep fatigue that sometimes hit omegas during stress cycles. He'd noticed. Of course, he'd noticed. He always noticed when something was physically wrong with me. You should rest, he said, guiding me to the leather sofa in his study. I'll have someone bring tea. But when the tea came, he didn't leave. He sat beside me, closer than usual, his shoulder pressing against mine. The warmth of him seeped through my clothes, and I felt my omega instincts stirring, reaching toward him like plants toward sunlight. Jawoon, my voice came out smaller than I intended. He turned to look at me. Really? At me. His dark eyes traced over my face with an intensity I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had, but I'd convinced myself it was my imagination. You've been with me a long time, he said quietly. Haven't you, Hyun? My throat tightened. Since we were children. Since we were children, he repeated. Something flickered in his expression, something almost like pain. And you've never wanted anything else? Only you. I wanted to say, only ever you, but the words wouldn't come. They were too big, too heavy, too weighted with years of longing. Instead, I whispered, I've always known where I belong. His breath caught. I heard it. I felt it. This close. His chest, rising and falling in a rhythm that matched mine. And then he moved. His arm came around me, pulling me against him. His other hand found my face, fingers brushing along my jaw, tilting my chin up. His scent flooded my senses, cedar and rain, and something deeper, something alpha, something that made my omega core sing with recognition. Stay with me, he said, and his voice was rough, raw, stripped of all its usual composure. Stay here tonight. My heart stopped, started again, pounded so hard I was sure he could feel it through my ribs. This is it, I thought. This is the moment. This is what I've been waiting for. He does feel it. He just doesn't know how to say it. But this is him saying it. I stayed. We didn't do anything more than hold each other. He wrapped me in a blanket from his own bed, settled me against his chest, and we lay there in the dark while his heartbeat drummed steady beneath my ear. At some point, I felt his lips press against the top of my head, soft, barely there, but real. I fell asleep crying, not from sadness, from relief. He does feel it. He does. I wasn't wrong. I wasn't wrong about everything. The next morning, he was gone before I woke. A note on the pillow beside me, written in his precise handwriting. Had an early meeting. Breakfast is in the kitchen. I'll call you later. He did call. He always called. And I held on to that night like a lifeline, like proof, like the validation I'd been starving for my entire life. I didn't know then that I was holding onto a lie. The engagement celebration was held at the Park family estate on the first evening of autumn. Golden ivory decorations filled the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over hundreds of guests, family members, business associates, political figures, everyone who mattered in our world. My parents beamed with satisfaction. His parents moved through the crowd with practiced grace, and I stood near the center of it all, dressed in pale silk that had been chosen for me, a champagne flute in my hand that I barely touched, watching. Seojin had come at my invitation. He stood near the terrace doors, looking handsome in a dark blue suit, laughing at something one of the younger alphas had said. He caught my eye across the room and raised his glass with a warm smile, and I smiled back automatically, even as my stomach churned with something I refused to name. Jawoon was beside me. He had been all evening dutiful, attentive, exactly what an alpha fianc should be. His hand rested at the small of my back. He introduced me to his father's colleagues with carefully rehearsed words. He looked at me with an expression that could have been affection if you didn't examine it too closely, but I examined it. I always examined it, and I noticed the way his gaze kept drifting toward the terrace. Stop it, I told myself. Stop looking for problems that aren't there. He's here with you. He's always here with you. That night meant something. It had to mean something. The evening wore on. Speeches were made. Toasts were raised. I smiled until my face ached, and Jaewoon's hand never left my back, and everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be. Everything was. And then the pressure in the room shifted. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the combination of so many scents in an enclosed space. Maybe it was the rising emotions, the expectations, the weight of tradition pressing down on all of us. Maybe it was simply time running out on whatever cosmic clock governed these things. But suddenly, the air grew thick. Alphas around the room stiffened. Omegas exchanged confused glances. Even the betas paused, sensing something they couldn't quite identify. And Jawoon went rigid beside me. His scent erupted. There's no other word for it. One moment, it was his familiar cedar and rain, controlled and subtle and safe. The next, it was a tidal wave, dark, primal, hungry, flooding the space around us so intensely that several nearby guests stumbled back. His eyes changed. The pupils blew wide, nearly swallowing the iris. His breathing turned ragged. His hand dropped from my back as if I'd burned him. Jawoon, ah. My voice was a stranger's voice, thin, terrified. He didn't hear me. He was looking at someone across the room, his entire body oriented toward that direction like a compass finding north, like a planet locked into orbit, like something that had been sleeping inside him had finally woken up. I followed his gaze. Seojin stood frozen by the terrace doors, his face pale, his own omega scent spiking with confusion and alarm. He looked at Jawoon. He looked at me. His lips parted like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. And then someone in the crowd whispered, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a blade. That's a mate reaction. The words spread. I heard them ripple outward, passed from mouth to mouth, each repetition landing like a physical blow. Mate reaction. Did you see that? The park air. But his fianc is right there. Who is that omega by the terrace? My body went cold. then hot, then nothing at all. Jawoon took a step toward Seojin. Not consciously, I could see the confusion warring with instinct in his expression. He looked like a man drowning, reaching for something he didn't understand, but couldn't resist. Jawoon. Seojin's voice cracked. What? What's happening? Another step. The room held its breath. And I stood there, frozen in silk and gold, a champagne flute still clutched in my numb fingers, watching my entire future dissolve in front of me. This isn't happening. This isn't real. He's my alpha. He's always been my alpha. But the truth was written in his scent, in his eyes, in the way his entire being reached toward someone else, with an urgency he had never not once shown me. Flashbacks hit me like waves. Every moment I'd misinterpreted. Every touch I'd read too much into. Every hope I'd built on foundations of duty rather than desire. The night in his apartment. Stay with me. He'd been confused, overwhelmed by instinct. Not love. Not even close to love. Just confusion. Just his body trying to understand something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. And I had taken it as confirmation. I had taken everything as confirmation, because that's what I did. That's what I'd always done. The room slowly came back into focus. Jae-woon's mother was speaking rapidly to someone. My father's face had gone dangerously blank. Guests were being ushered toward the exits by staff who moved with practiced crisis management. And Seojin was being led away by one of the Park family doctors. His expression, still dazed, still frightened, still looking back at me over his shoulder with something that might have been apology or might have been pity. I didn't want either. Jawoon hadn't moved. The initial surge of instinct seemed to have passed, leaving him standing in the center of the emptying ballroom like a statue carved from stone. His chest heaved. His hands trembled at his sides. Slowly, so slowly, he turned to face me. Our eyes met. I had spent my entire life learning to read his expressions. The slight furrow between his brows that meant he was thinking. The almost invisible tightening of his jaw that meant he was holding something back. The softening around his eyes that I had always interpreted as affection meant just for me. Now I looked at him and saw nothing I recognized. I opened my mouth. The words that came out weren't the ones I planned. Then what am I? A whisper, barely that, but it landed like a scream. Jawoon flinched. I thought he stopped, swallowed. His voice was hoarse, raw, nothing like the composed alpha I knew. I thought it was you. I thought the bond would form, eventually. That if I just waited long enough, if I just tried hard enough. He trailed off. The silence stretched, and in that silence, I understood everything. He had been waiting too, not for me, never for me, but for the bond that was supposed to be there. The bond our families had promised. The bond I had built my entire identity around. He had been going through the motions, performing the role of fiancé, hoping that someday his instincts would catch up to his obligations. But they hadn't. They never would. Because fate, cruel, indifferent, accurate fate had reserved his bond for someone else. And I was just the placeholder, the promise, the childhood arrangement that had kept him company while he waited for the real thing. I looked at him, at this man I had loved since before I understood what love was, at this alpha who had been my entire world while I had only ever been a temporary fixture in his. And I said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. He hesitated. For the first time in all the years I'd known him, Park Jawoon controlled, composed. Always certain Park Jawoon hesitated. I never meant to. Don't. The word came out. Flat. Empty. All the emotion drained out of me like water from a broken vessel. He stopped. The last guests were leaving. Staff were extinguishing candles. The beautiful, perfect lies of our engagement celebration were being dismantled piece by piece. And I stood in the wreckage of everything I had believed about my life. I wasn't his future. I was just the promise he made before fate gave him someone better.